The USA and communism pre-1945. What was the American response to communism from 1917 to 1945? American perspective. For Americans, communism was a political system that must be opposed because it suppressed human rights at home and was expansionist abroad. When Russia became communist during World War I, the US feared the possibility of a worldwide spread of that ideology. If communism spread, with whom would they trade? What would happen to multi-party democracies such as their own? The US and the USSR. Historian Martin Macaulay emphasized that the US and the USSR were in competition with one another. Each was convinced of their own rectitude or righteousness and of the other's expansionist plans. Each saw the other as a threat to its own existence, and each engaged in behavior that confirmed the other's fears. An early 1900s timeline. In 1918, American troops intervened in Russia in an unsuccessful attempt to prevent a communist regime. In 1933, after refusing to recognize the USSR's existence, the US, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration, finally gave it diplomatic recognition. In 1941, Hitler declared war on the US, after which the US and the USSR became allies in the struggle against Nazi Germany. The situation in 1945. Some believe that the prospects for continuing cooperation between the US and the USSR in 1945 were hopeful. Many historians highlight the events from 1917 to 1933 as a marriage of convenience and emphasize the tensions during World War II to demonstrate that the Cold War was inevitable. Past suspicions based on ideology, along with the points of clash in the Second World War, both built up to a great power struggle. In summary, the US was a multi-party state with a capitalist economy of minimal government intervention and wide variations in wealth, and it felt safer if other countries were not communist. Meanwhile, the USSR was a one-party state because the Communist Party was the party of the people, and thus they needed only one party. They used communism, a state-controlled economy with wealth equally distributed, and it felt safer if other countries were communist as well.
In 1945, the USA and the USSR were allies, but split as enemies within a few years, due to differing leader personalities, relative powers of the two nations, and differing ideologies. December 7, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and prompts Germany to declare war on the United States. The United States joins forces with the USSR and Britain to form the Grand Alliance, which faces high tensions between the USA and USSR. Information about the atomic bomb was shared with Britain, but not the USSR, which causes very high tensions. Roosevelt brought the USSR into the Grand Alliance, and when he passed in April 1945, inexperienced VP Harry Truman was left behind with a country unparalleled in economic and military might. The orthodox interpretation about why the Cold War began had Westerners blaming Stalin for the Cold War. The revisionist interpretation began in 1950 and blamed both the United States for the war. The post-revisionist interpretation equally blamed the US and USSR, and in conclusion, post-revisionists were correct. Both of them were expansionists and the two greatest powers in the world, so issues were bound to arise.
The Truman Doctrine and Containment. Soviet-American relations deteriorated between August 1945 and March 1947 due to tensions over Stalin's creation of a communist Eastern Europe. Stalin put pressure on Turkey for naval access after World War II because Roosevelt and Churchill recognized his interests during the war. In March 1947, Truman went to Congress to obtain $300 million for Greece and $100 million for Turkey so that these countries can combat communist threat. Truman made a speech that emphasized the importance of combating communism. In February 1946, the State Department Soviet specialists sent a long telegram from Moscow, which urged U.S. resistance to Soviet expansionism. In July 1947, Kennan published an article claiming that the U.S. should contain the USSR. The Truman administration approved of the article and implemented the policy of containment. The Truman Doctrine caused significant involvement in Korea, Vietnam, and Europe to combat communism. Some criticized the doctrine as unnecessary for having no limits and being an ideological crusade because of the fear that the U.S. would engage in a perpetual Cold War. The Truman Doctrine in Latin America. U.S. foreign policy goals differed from that of Latin American nations. Truman wanted an anti-communist alliance, but Latin Americans wanted economic and technological aid to combat poverty and improve their economies. A conference of American nations was held in Rio de Janeiro in September 1947. Truman pushed for a collective security system while Latin America sought for American economic aid. Participants of the Rio Conference signed the Rio Treaty and agreed that an attack on one American nation would mean an attack on all and would merit resistance if two-thirds agreed on action. The U.S. considered it to be a success because they believed the national security system was necessary to combat communism, but Latin Americans were disappointed because it made them compulsory automatic allies of the United States. Brazil, Chile, and Cuba banned communist organizations and cut off diplomatic relations with the U.S. Pan-American conferences were held in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and the participants were known as the Pan-American Union. At Columbia in 1948, the Union of American Republics was reconstituted as the Organization of American States. The OAS established hemispheric consultation and military strategy. To the U.S., the OAS represented hemispheric unity against communism, but Latin American nations wanted a charter of the OAS to govern hemispheric relations in fear of the U.S. dominating the organization. The U.S. viewed everything through a Cold War lens, and this is evident in their perspective of the Colombian riots. Latin American leaders saw the riots as products of economic problems, while the U.S. interpreted it as a result of communism. Latin American nations pressed for the U.S. to improve aid, and in response, the U.S. told them to rely on their own private sectors. In 1948, the U.S. ambassador to Brazil explained that Western Europe got more aid than Latin America because the U.S. didn't see Latin America as under immediate communist threat. In 1949, Truman asked Congress to authorize his Point 4 program, and the Truman administration grouped Latin America with Asia and Africa in this program. Between 1949 and 1953, Latin America received $20 million, while the rest of the world received $18 billion. Getulio Vargas criticized Truman, saying, "You evidently do not perceive the depth of our economic crisis." Insufficient economic support for Latin America led to anti-Americanism.
The Cold War in American society and culture. Truman and the Red Scare. The first American Red Scare happened after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. The second Red Scare happened after World War II and the rise of the powerful communist regime in the Soviet Union. Americans feared the communists because it threatened their idea of the American dream. Truman and the Red Scare. HUAC, House of American Activities, was established on May 26, 1938. In 1947, Republicans gained control of the Congress, and HUAC started investigating communist threats in Hollywood and then Broadway. This started the Artists Blacklist, where movies, books, plays, directors, artists, and actors were blacklisted for having communist ideals. Artists took an anti-communist stance to avoid blacklisting. In 1947, Truman signed Executive Order 9835, which authorized loyalty investigations of federal employees. HUAC begins investigating Hollywood and Broadway. In 1950, the Internal Security Act, members of communist organizations had to register with the American government or face federal fines or jail time. President Truman tried to veto the Internal Security Act, claiming it was unconstitutional, but was overturned. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were arrested and executed in 1950. Between 1947 and 1952, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI led loyalty investigations. Although numbers vary, it is estimated that there were 3,000 investigations, 14,000 inquiries, and over 1,000 dismissals and several thousand resignations. Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was born to an Irish family in Wisconsin. He was elected to the Senate in 1946, and in 1949, a Washington poll named McCarthy the worst U.S. senator. To gain good publicity, McCarthy accused several communists in the State Department,
When McCarthy was revealed to be lying, McCarthy supporters distributed fake photographs to criminalize the head of the investigation and costing him his re-election. This was the start of McCarthyism. The McCarthy investigations. McCarthy headed congressional communist investigations, but by 1953, media, entertainment, colleges, and universities had joined the witch hunts. An estimated 500 federal and local government employees, 600 school teachers, and 150 college professors lost their jobs. How McCarthy got away with it. McCarthy terrorized Americans with communist accusations and directly cost the Democratic Party defeat in 1950. Many senators were too afraid to call McCarthy out, not willing to draw his fire, but those who did lost the 1952 congressional election. McCarthy kept a good relationship with the press, so they were rarely hostile to him. The fall of McCarthy. McCarthy started getting bold with his accusations, and one day eventually started accusing World War II heroes Dean Acheson and George Marshall. McCarthy showed up drunk to trials and was also very disheveled. The final straw was the McCarthy Army hearings, where the U.S. Army sued McCarthy and his ratings plummeted. In 1955, the Senate finally censored him. In 1957, he died due to complications in his liver.